The carriage wheels had barely stopped creaking when a small boy came running across the gravel path, his shoes slipping, his breath coming out in short gasps, and his voice cracking as he screamed for the Duke to stop. Duke Alaric Whitmore turned sharply, one hand already resting on the carriage door, his patience thin after a week of delayed meetings and unfinished business. He was due in the capital before sunset, and the roads through the hills were already treacherous enough without losing daylight. He looked down at the boy kneeling now at his feet, chest heaving, eyes wide with something that looked less like fear and more like desperation. "Please," the boy said, gripping the hem of the Duke's coat with both hands. "Don't get into that carriage, please, sir. Not today." The Duke's steward, a stern man named Harold Bennett, stepped forward at once, ready to pull the boy away. But the Duke raised a hand, stopping him. Something about the boy's voice unsettled him. It was not the voice of a child throwing a tantrum. It was the voice of someone who had seen something terrible and could not shake it loose from his mind. "Who is this boy?" the Duke asked, though he already suspected the answer. "That is Eli, sir," Harold said stiffly. "Son of Margaret, the head maid. He has no business being out here." Margaret came rushing from the servants' entrance at that very moment, her apron still dusted with flour, her face pale with horror at the sight of her son, clutching the Duke's coat in front of the entire household staff. She reached him in seconds, pulling him back by the shoulders, whispering frantic apologies. "Forgive him, your grace. He does not know what he is saying. Eli, let go this instant." But Eli did not let go. He turned his head toward his mother, tears now streaking down his cheeks, and said the same thing again, this time louder, as if saying it once more might finally make someone believe him. "The wheel is going to break, I saw it. Please don't let him go." The courtyard fell silent. Even the horses seemed to still their restless stamping, as though sensing the sudden tension in the air. The Duke looked at the boy for a long moment, his jaw tight, his mind working through a dozen thoughts at once. He had heard servants speak of premonitions before, whispered stories passed around kitchen fires late at night, tales meant to frighten children into obedience. He did not believe in such things. He was a man of reason, of ledgers and treaties and carefully worded contracts. He did not believe in visions. And yet, there was something about the way the boy's small hands trembled, something about the raw certainty in his voice, that made the Duke hesitate before stepping fully into the carriage. He had traveled this road 100 times before. He knew every turn, every steep drop along the cliffside path that led toward the capital. If something did go wrong on that road, there would be no room for error. No one would survive a fall from that height. "Your Grace," Harold said carefully, glancing nervously at the darkening sky, "we are already behind schedule. The council meeting cannot wait, and the roads will only grow more difficult the longer we delay." The Duke did not answer right away. He crouched down instead, lowering himself to the boy's level, something he had never done for a servant's child before. Eli flinched slightly at the sudden closeness, but did not look away. "Tell me exactly what you saw," the Duke said quietly. Eli hesitated, glancing at his mother, who gave him a small, uncertain nod. He took a shaky breath and spoke, his words tumbling out quickly now that someone was finally listening. "I was near the stables last night. I heard voices behind the carriage house. I did not see who it was too dark, but I heard metal like someone working on something they should not have been touching, and then I dreamed about it. I dreamed the wheel came off on the mountain road, right where it turns by the old oak tree. I saw the carriage go over the edge. I saw it happen so clearly, I could not stop thinking about it all morning." Harold let out an impatient breath, clearly ready to dismiss the boy's words as nothing more than a child's overactive imagination fed by too many frightening bedtime stories. But the Duke remained still, his eyes narrowing slightly as he considered the details. A dream was easy to dismiss. Voices near the stables at night, however, working on something in secret, was not so easily explained away. "You heard voices," the Duke repeated, "near the carriage house last night." Yes, sir. I did not think much of it at first. I thought it might be one of the grooms doing late repairs. But then I had the dream and it felt different. It felt like a warning, not just a nightmare. The Duke straightened up slowly, his gaze shifting toward the carriage itself, gleaming black and polished, its wheels freshly oiled, its frame appearing perfectly sound in the morning light. Nothing about it looked wrong. Nothing about it gave any hint of danger. And yet, the boy's words had planted a seed of doubt that the Duke could not simply shake away, no matter how firmly his rational mind told him to climb inside and be on his way. "Your Grace, we truly cannot afford further delay," Harold pressed again, his voice edged with growing frustration. "The council will not wait, and if we lose the light on that mountain road, the danger will only increase." "Then we will make time," the Duke said finally, his voice firm enough to end the discussion. "Have the mechanic inspect the carriage before we depart. Every wheel, every bolt, every strap. I want it done thoroughly." Harold's mouth opened as if to argue further, but one look at the Duke's expression told him the decision was final. He nodded stiffly and turned to send for the estate's mechanic, a quiet, careful man named Peter Langley, who had maintained the Whitmore carriages for nearly a decade without a single complaint. Margaret, meanwhile, pulled Eli aside, kneeling in front of him with tears now brimming in her own eyes. She was terrified, not of the carriage, but of what might happen to her son, to both of them, if the Duke decided this entire display had been nothing more than foolishness. Servants had been dismissed for far less than causing a public scene in front of visiting nobles and household staff alike. "Eli, whatever happens now, you must not say another word unless the Duke asks you directly," she whispered urgently. "Do you understand me? We cannot afford trouble." Eli nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the carriage, his small body still trembling with the leftover adrenaline of having spoken up against a man so far above his station. He did not regret it, not even for a moment, no matter what punishment might follow. The dream had been too vivid, too real to ignore. He would rather face anger than silence and risk something terrible happening because he had said nothing. Peter Langley arrived within minutes, his tool bag slung over one shoulder, his expression puzzled as he approached the gleaming carriage that had, as far as he knew, been in perfect working condition just 2 days earlier when he had last serviced it. He greeted the Duke with a respectful bow before beginning his inspection, running his hands along the wheels, checking the axles, tugging gently at the straps securing the frame. The courtyard grew quiet as everyone waited, the only sound the occasional shuffle of hooves from the impatient horses and the soft rustle of wind through the trees lining the estate's front drive. Minutes passed. The Duke stood with his arms crossed, watching closely, while Harold shifted uncomfortably beside him, clearly still convinced this entire ordeal was an unnecessary waste of precious time. Peter straightened up after several minutes, wiping his hands on a cloth, his expression neutral. "Everything looks fine at first glance, Your Grace," he said. "Wheels are secure, straps are tight, nothing appears loose or damaged." Harold let out a small sound of vindication, glancing pointedly at the Duke, as though to say the matter was now settled. The Duke, however, did not immediately relax. He looked once more at Eli, who was watching Peter's inspection with an intensity far beyond what one would expect from a child his age. "Check again," the Duke said. "Look closer this time, beneath the surface, not just what is visible." Peter hesitated only a moment before nodding, returning to the carriage with renewed focus. He crouched down near the rear wheel, running his fingers along the axle more carefully this time, feeling for anything that might not be immediately obvious to the eye. He paused, his brow furrowed. He leaned in closer, angling his head to get a better look at the underside of the axle where fresh grease had been applied a bit too generously, almost as if someone had been trying to hide something beneath the shine. "Your Grace," Peter said slowly, his voice suddenly tense, "I think you should come look at this." The Duke crossed the courtyard in a few quick strides, kneeling down beside Peter to see what had caught his attention. There, hidden just beneath a thick smear of fresh grease, was a bolt worn down to almost nothing, its threads nearly stripped away entirely, weakened not by age or ordinary wear, but by something far more deliberate. It was the kind of damage that did not happen naturally. It was the kind of damage that took time, tools, and intention to create. The courtyard fell utterly silent. Even Harold, who had been so quick to dismiss the entire situation as foolishness, now stood frozen, staring down at the damaged bolt with an expression of dawning horror. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, and Eli, standing a few steps back, simply watched, his small face pale but unsurprised, as though some quiet part of him had known all along that his warning had not been imagination after all. The Duke rose slowly to his feet, his gaze sweeping across the courtyard, across the faces of his staff, across the carriage that had nearly carried him to his death on a road with no room for mercy. His mind raced through the implications of what he was seeing. This was not an accident waiting to happen. This was something planned. Someone within his own household, someone with access to the Carriage house, someone who knew exactly which road he would be traveling and exactly when, had wanted him gone. He turned back to Eli, and for the first time since the boy had grabbed his coat in desperation, the Duke's expression held no trace of irritation at all. What remained instead was something closer to unease, mixed with a grudging, unsettled respect for a boy who had risked everything to speak up when silence would have been so much easier. "You said you heard voices," the Duke said quietly. "Can you describe anything else? Any detail at all, no matter how small it might seem?" Eli thought hard, his young mind straining to recall every fragment of the previous night. There were two of them, I think. One voice was low, like it belonged to a man used to giving orders. The other sounded nervous, like he did not want to be there. I could not hear everything they said, but I remember one of them mentioning the mountain road, and I remember him saying something about how it needed to look like an accident. The words hung heavy in the courtyard air. Harold's face had drained of all color now, the earlier irritation replaced entirely by the grim realization of just how close disaster had come to striking the estate. Margaret pulled Eli close against her side, her arms wrapped protectively around him, though her eyes remained fixed on the Duke, waiting anxiously to see what would happen next. The Duke looked once more at the ruined bolt, then at the road stretching out beyond the estate gates, winding up toward the distant mountains, where a single sharp turn near an old oak tree would have offered no chance of survival to anyone caught in a carriage with a failing wheel. He thought of how close he had come to dismissing the boy entirely, how easily pride and impatience could have carried him straight into a trap someone had carefully prepared. "Bring me every servant who had access to the Carriage house last night," the Duke said, his voice low and controlled, though anger simmered clearly beneath the surface. "Quietly, I do not want whoever did this to know we have discovered it yet." Harold nodded quickly, grateful for a task that gave him something useful to do, and hurried off to begin gathering names and schedules. The courtyard slowly began to stir again as the initial shock wore off, servants exchanging worried glances, whispers spreading quickly despite the Duke's request for discretion. Margaret finally allowed herself to breathe, though the fear in her chest had not fully faded. She looked down at her son, who was still watching the Duke with quiet, careful eyes, and felt a strange mixture of pride and terror settle over her. Whatever came next, she knew their lives, and perhaps the fate of the entire Whitmore estate, had just shifted onto a very different path. The Duke, for his part, remained standing beside the damaged carriage for a long moment after everyone else had scattered to their tasks. He looked down at the small boy who had saved his life. A boy with no title, no wealth, no reason at all to be believed, and yet somehow, against every instinct of logic and reason, he had been exactly right. "Eli," the Duke said finally, his voice quieter now, almost gentle, "you will come with me today, not on the road, here to my study. I have questions, and I suspect you may have more answers than you realize." Eli nodded, still slightly stunned by the sudden shift in how the Duke was speaking to him, no longer as an unruly child causing a scene, but as someone whose words carried real weight. He glanced up at his mother, who gave him a small, trembling smile of encouragement, before following the Duke across the courtyard, past the ruined carriage, and into the grand estate house where the true unraveling of the plot against the Duke's life was only just beginning. Behind them, the carriage sat abandoned in the morning light, its polished frame no longer a symbol of comfort and status, but a silent, dangerous reminder of how close betrayal had come to succeeding, and how a single warning from an unlikely voice had changed everything in an instant. The study was quiet except for the soft crackle of the fireplace and the steady ticking of a tall clock in the corner. Eli stood near the doorway, unsure of where to place himself in a room filled with leather-bound books, polished wood, and paintings of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow every movement. The Duke gestured toward a chair across from his desk, and Eli sat down carefully, his hands folded tightly in his lap. "I want you to think back again," the Duke said, taking his own seat and leaning forward with his elbows resting on the desk. "Not the dream, the voices. You said one sounded like a man used to giving orders. Can you think of anyone on this estate who speaks that way?" Eli hesitated, his young mind sifting through faces and voices he had heard throughout his life on the estate. There were many men who worked for the Duke, grooms and gardeners and stable hands, but few of them carried themselves with the kind of authority the boy had sensed in that low, commanding voice near the carriage house. "It was not a voice I hear often," Eli said slowly. "It was not one of the grooms. I know their voices well because I help feed the horses sometimes. This was different, deeper maybe, and it sounded like someone who was used to people listening to him without question." The Duke's jaw tightened slightly. There were only a handful of men on the estate who spoke with that kind of natural command, and most of them were family, trusted relatives who had free access to every corner of the property, including the carriage house, without anyone thinking to question their presence. "And the second voice," the Duke continued, "the nervous one, did it sound familiar at all?" Eli nodded slightly, though uncertainty flickered across his face. "A little. I think it might have been one of the younger stable hands. Daniel, maybe. He always sounds nervous when he talks to anyone above him, even when he has done nothing wrong." The Duke made a mental note of the name, though he kept his expression carefully neutral, unwilling to alarm the boy further or reveal just how seriously he was taking every fragment of information being offered. He rose from his chair and walked toward the window, looking out over the estate grounds, his mind turning over the possibilities with growing unease. There was a knock at the study door moments later, and Harold entered, carrying a small ledger filled with the names of every servant who had access to the carriage house the previous night. The Duke took the ledger and scanned through it quickly, his eyes narrowing as he reached a particular name near the bottom of the list. "Edmund was here last night," the Duke said quietly, almost to himself. Harold's expression shifted immediately, a flicker of concern crossing his otherwise composed face. Edmund Whitmore was the Duke's cousin, a man who had grown up alongside him, sharing meals and lessons and childhood adventures across the very grounds they now stood upon. Edmund had always been close to the family, trusted enough to move freely through every part of the estate without question, including the stables and the carriage house where the horses and vehicles were kept. "Edmund often visits the stables, Your Grace," Harold said carefully, though his voice carried a note of hesitation. "He has always taken an interest in the horses. It would not be unusual for him to be there." "No," the Duke agreed slowly, "it would not be unusual at all." But the Duke's mind was already working through a darker possibility, one he did not want to consider but could not fully push aside either. Edmund stood to inherit a significant portion of the estate's holdings should anything happen to the Duke, given the current absence of any direct heir. It was a fact the Duke had never given much thought to before, trusting his cousin's loyalty without question. Now, however, that trust felt suddenly fragile, cracked open by the discovery of a deliberately weakened bolt hidden beneath fresh grease. "Find Daniel," the Duke instructed Harold. "Quietly. Bring him to the east study, not this one. I do not want anyone connecting the two conversations." Harold nodded and left immediately, and the Duke turned back to Eli, who had been listening intently to the entire exchange despite his young age. The boy's sharp attentiveness did not go unnoticed by the Duke, who found himself increasingly impressed by how carefully Eli processed everything happening around him. "You have done well," the Duke said. "Better than most grown men would have managed in your position, but I need you to stay quiet about everything you have heard here today. Can you do that for me?" Eli nodded firmly. "Yes, sir, I will not say anything." The Duke almost smiled at the boy's earnest determination, though the weight of the situation kept any real humor from surfacing. He asked Eli to wait in a small adjoining room while he continued his investigation, and the boy obeyed without complaint, settling onto a cushioned bench near the window, watching the estate grounds below with quiet curiosity. Nearly half an hour passed before Harold returned, this time accompanied by a young stable hand whose face had gone noticeably pale, his hands twisting nervously at the hem of his worn jacket. This was Daniel, the boy Eli had suspected might be the second voice he heard near the Carriage house the previous night. He entered the east study with obvious reluctance, his eyes darting nervously between the Duke and Harold, clearly sensing that something serious was happening, even if he did not yet understand exactly what. "Daniel," the Duke began, his voice calm but firm, carrying the kind of authority that left no room for evasion. "I need you to tell me exactly what you were doing near the Carriage house last night." Daniel's face flushed, and for a moment it seemed he might try to deny everything entirely. But something in the Duke's steady gaze seemed to strip away whatever courage he might have mustered for a lie, and his shoulders slumped in defeat almost immediately. "I did not want to do it, Your Grace," Daniel said, his voice cracking with fear. "I swear I did not want to. He told me if I did not help, he would see to it that my family lost their positions here, that we would be turned out with nothing. I have younger sisters, Your Grace. I did not know what else to do." The Duke's expression darkened, though he kept his voice steady, unwilling to frighten the boy into silence before extracting every piece of information he needed. "Who threatened you, Daniel? Tell me his name." Daniel's eyes welled with tears as he finally spoke the name aloud, confirming what the Duke had already begun to suspect. "Edmund, Your Grace, your cousin. He came to me 2 nights ago and told me exactly what needed to be done to the carriage. He said it needed to look like an ordinary accident, nothing more. He said if anyone asked, I was to say I saw nothing unusual at all." The room fell into heavy silence. Harold stood rigid near the door, his expression a mixture of shock and quiet anger, while the Duke absorbed the confirmation of his worst suspicion, with a controlled, simmering fury that betrayed itself only in the tight clench of his jaw and the whitening of his knuckles against the edge of his desk. "Did he say why?" the Duke asked quietly. "Did he say what he hoped to gain from my death?" Daniel hesitated, glancing nervously at Harold before answering. "He spoke of the estate, Your Grace. He said it was rightfully his by blood, that he had waited long enough, and that you had no direct heir to challenge his claim once you were gone. He seemed certain no one would ever suspect him, given how close your families have always been." The Duke closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the full weight of the betrayal. Edmund had grown up in this very house, had shared countless meals at the same table, had been trusted with responsibilities across the estate that few others outside the immediate family had ever received. And yet, beneath that familiar face, an entirely different man had apparently been waiting patiently for an opportunity to seize everything for himself. "Where is Edmund now?" the Duke asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I believe he rode out early this morning, Your Grace," Harold answered carefully. "Before the carriage inspection began. He mentioned business in the northern district, though I did not think much of it at the time." The Duke's eyes narrowed sharply. Of course Edmund had left early. He would have wanted to be far from the estate when news of the accident eventually reached him, ensuring no immediate suspicion could fall upon his absence. It was a carefully calculated move, one that spoke to just how thoroughly Edmund had planned every detail of his betrayal. "Send riders after him immediately," the Duke ordered, rising from his chair with sudden urgency. "Discreetly. I want him brought back to the estate before he realizes his plan has failed. And Daniel." The young stable hand flinched at the sound of his name, clearly bracing himself for punishment. "You will not lose your position here," the Duke said, his voice softening slightly despite the tension still gripping the room. "You were placed in an impossible situation by a man who abused the trust this family placed in him, but you will testify to everything you have told me here today when the time comes. Do you understand?" Daniel nodded quickly, relief flooding across his tear-streaked face. "Yes, Your Grace. Thank you, thank you." Harold moved swiftly to arrange for riders to track Edmund's movements, while the Duke remained in the study, staring out the window toward the distant hills where his cousin had likely already begun putting significant distance between himself and the estate. The Duke's thoughts churned with a mixture of anger, betrayal, and a growing, uncomfortable awareness of just how easily the entire plot could have succeeded had it not been for the desperate warning of a maid's young son. He returned to the adjoining room where Eli had been waiting patiently, still perched on the cushioned bench by the window. The boy looked up immediately as the Duke entered, sensing from his expression that something significant had happened during his absence. "We found the man responsible," the Duke said simply, settling into a chair near the boy. "Your instincts were correct in every detail. I owe you a debt I am not certain I can properly repay." Eli shook his head modestly, clearly uncomfortable with the weight of gratitude being placed upon him. "I only told you what I heard, sir, and what I dreamed. I do not fully understand it myself." The Duke studied the boy for a long moment, considering the strange, unexplainable nature of what had unfolded that morning. He was not a man inclined toward superstition, yet he could not deny the plain truth sitting before him. Whatever had guided Eli to that courtyard with such desperate certainty, it had saved his life, and quite possibly the future of the entire Whitmore estate along with it. "Whatever it is," the Duke said finally, "I intend to make certain it was not wasted. You and your mother will want for nothing from this day forward. But first, we must finish what has begun. Edmund will not surrender easily, and I fear this matter is far from over." Outside the study window, the sound of hooves thundered across the estate grounds as riders departed swiftly toward the northern district, carrying with them the urgent task of intercepting a man who believed his carefully constructed plan had already succeeded, unaware that a single frightened boy had unraveled everything before it had even truly begun. The riders reached the edge of the northern district, just as the afternoon sun began slipping behind a bank of gray clouds, casting long shadows across the winding dirt road that led toward the trading town of Millbrook. Edmund Whitmore rode ahead of them, unaware that pursuit had already begun, his mind occupied instead with quiet calculations about how quickly news of the Duke's death might reach him, and how convincingly he would need to perform grief in front of the household staff and neighboring nobles alike. He had planned everything carefully. The weakened bolt would give way somewhere along the steepest curve of the mountain road, exactly where the old oak tree marked the sharpest turn before the land dropped away into a rocky ravine below. No one would question a broken axle on a road known for its dangerous conditions. Carriages had failed there before, though never quite so conveniently. Edmund had simply ensured history would repeat itself at precisely the right moment. What he did not know, what he could not have anticipated, was that his entire plan had unraveled within hours of his departure, thanks to a boy he had never once bothered to notice among the estate's many servants. The lead rider, a broad-shouldered man named Gregory Ashford who had served the Whitmore family for over 15 years, spotted Edmund's horse near the outskirts of Millbrook and signaled quietly to the two men riding alongside him. They approached with practiced caution, careful not to alert Edmund too soon, unwilling to risk him fleeing further before they could properly detain him. Edmund noticed the riders when they were still some distance away, and something in the deliberate way they positioned themselves around him sent an immediate chill through his chest. He straightened in his saddle, forcing a casual smile onto his face as Gregory approached. "Gregory," Edmund said, his voice carrying practiced warmth despite the sudden tension coiling in his stomach. "What brings you all the way out here?" "The Duke requests your immediate return to the estate," Gregory said evenly, his expression giving nothing away. "There has been an incident he wishes to discuss with you personally." Edmund's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before he composed himself again. "An incident? Is everyone well? Has something happened to him?" "He is quite well," Gregory replied, watching Edmund closely. "The incident involved his carriage. Fortunately, it was discovered before departure." The color drained from Edmund's face so quickly that even the other riders noticed the sudden shift, though none of them spoke of it aloud. Edmund forced himself to maintain composure, though his mind raced through every possible explanation he might offer should his involvement somehow already be suspected. "I see," Edmund said carefully. "Well, of course, I will return at once. Is there anything else I should know?" Gregory's expression remained carefully neutral. "The Duke will explain everything himself, sir. He was quite insistent that you return without delay." There was little Edmund could do but agree, turning his horse back toward the estate with the three riders positioned closely around him, though not so closely as to appear openly suspicious to anyone who might witness their return. The ride back felt agonizingly long to Edmund, his thoughts spiraling through increasingly desperate possibilities as he tried to determine exactly how much the Duke might already know. Meanwhile, back at the estate, the Duke had spent the intervening hours carefully organizing every piece of evidence against his cousin, ensuring that when the confrontation finally occurred, there would be no room left for denial or manipulation. He gathered written statements from both Daniel and Peter Langley, documenting every detail of the sabotaged bolt and the threats used to coerce the young stable hand into silence. He also requested that Eli repeat his account once more, this time in the presence of Harold, to ensure the boy's testimony was properly recorded and corroborated. Margaret, still shaken by the events of the morning, hovered nervously near the kitchen entrance, unable to focus on her usual duties as she awaited news of what would happen next. She worried constantly about her son's safety, uncertain whether Edmund, upon learning of his role in exposing the plot, might seek some form of retaliation against the boy who had unknowingly destroyed his carefully constructed scheme. The Duke, sensing her anxiety during a brief moment when their paths crossed in the main hallway, paused to offer what reassurance he could. "Your son will be protected," he said firmly. "I give you my word on that. Whatever happens with Edmund, no harm will come to Eli because of what he revealed to me." Margaret nodded gratefully, though the worry in her eyes did not fully fade. She had lived long enough within the walls of noble estates to understand that promises, even well-intentioned ones, did not always survive the complicated realities of power and family loyalty. As evening approached, word finally arrived that Edmund and the riders were nearing the estate gates. The Duke gathered himself in his main study, arranging the evidence carefully upon his desk, with Harold standing nearby and two additional estate guards positioned discreetly near the door, ready should the confrontation turn difficult. Edmund entered the study with an expression of practiced concern, his earlier composure fully restored after the long ride back had given him time to construct a plausible defense for whatever accusations might be waiting for him. "Alaric," Edmund said warmly, using the Duke's given name in the familiar way only close family members were permitted. "I came as quickly as I could. Gregory mentioned something about the carriage. Please, Tell me you are unharmed." "I am unharmed," the Duke said evenly, watching his cousin's face closely for any flicker of genuine reaction. "No thanks to the man who tampered with my rear axle bolt sometime last night." Edmund's expression shifted into carefully constructed shock, his eyes widening with what appeared to be genuine horror. "Tampered? Someone deliberately damaged your carriage. Alaric, that is monstrous. Do you know who would do such a thing?" The Duke studied his cousin in silence for a long moment before reaching for the written statements laid out across his desk. "As it happens, I do know. I have a full account from Daniel, one of the stable hands, detailing exactly how he was threatened into assisting with the sabotage. He was quite specific about who approached him with the demand." The room grew tense as Edmund's carefully maintained composure began to crack at the edges, his eyes darting briefly toward the door before he forced himself to remain still, aware that any sudden movement would only confirm his guilt beyond question. "Alaric, surely you do not believe the word of some frightened stable boy over mine," Edmund said, his voice tightening despite his attempt to sound calm. "He is likely covering for someone else, or simply mistaken about what he heard." "He named you specifically," the Duke said, his voice hardening now, all pretense of casual conversation stripped away entirely. "He described your voice, your instructions, your threats against his family should he refuse to cooperate. And beyond his testimony, I have physical evidence of the sabotage itself, along with a witness who overheard your conversation near the Carriage house." Edmund's face paled dramatically at the mention of a witness, his mind racing through the implications of who might have overheard him, and Daniel discussing the plan in what he had believed was complete privacy under cover of darkness. "A witness," Edmund repeated slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who?" The study door opened at that moment, and Eli stepped inside, accompanied by his mother, who kept a protective hand on her son's shoulder as they entered. Edmund stared at the boy in stunned disbelief, clearly struggling to comprehend how a child, someone he had never given a second thought to among the countless servants populating the estate, could possibly have unraveled a plan he had spent weeks carefully constructing. "Him?" Edmund said, his voice rising with disbelief and something close to desperation. "You expect me to believe a servant's child overheard a private conversation and somehow understood enough of it to accuse me?" "He heard enough," the Duke said firmly. "Enough to warn me before I climbed into that carriage this morning. Enough to convince me to order an inspection that revealed exactly what you had done. You very nearly succeeded, Edmund. Had it not been for Eli, I would be dead right now, and you would already be planning how to present yourself as the grieving cousin stepping forward to manage the estate in my absence." Edmund's composure finally shattered entirely, his shoulders slumping as the weight of exposure settled fully upon him. For a long moment, he said nothing at all, staring blankly at the evidence spread across the Duke's desk, at the frightened but resolute boy standing near the doorway, at the cousin whose trust he had so thoroughly betrayed. "You do not understand what it has been like," Edmund finally said, his voice quiet and bitter. "Watching you inherit everything while I received scraps. Waiting patiently for years for some acknowledgement that never came. I have given this family decades of loyalty, and what have I received in return? Nothing. No title of my own, no true stake in anything beyond what you choose to grant me out of obligation." "So your solution was murder," the Duke said coldly, his earlier restraint giving way to open anger now. "Rather than speak to me honestly about your grievances, you chose to end my life and steal what was never meant to be taken through violence." Edmund had no answer for that, his silence serving as confirmation enough for everyone present in the room. Harold moved forward at the Duke's subtle signal, along with the two guards who had been waiting quietly near the entrance, ready to escort Edmund into confinement, while the Duke decided how best to handle the matter formally. As the guards approached, Edmund's expression shifted suddenly from defeat to something more desperate, his eyes darting once more toward the door, calculating whether any chance of escape still remained. But the guards moved quickly, positioning themselves on either side of him before he could act on whatever fleeting impulse had crossed his mind. And within moments he was being led firmly from the study, his protests fading as he was escorted toward a secured room elsewhere in the estate. The Duke remained standing behind his desk long after Edmund had been removed, the weight of the day's events finally settling fully upon him now that the immediate danger had passed. He looked toward Eli, who stood quietly beside his mother, still processing everything that had just unfolded in front of him. "You did more than save my life today," the Duke said quietly. "You exposed a betrayal that might have gone unnoticed for years, allowing Edmund to eventually find another opportunity to finish what he started. I owe you far more than words can properly express." Margaret, overwhelmed by the events of the day, finally allowed a few tears to fall, though they carried relief now rather than fear. She pulled Eli close against her side, grateful beyond measure that her son's desperate warning had been taken seriously rather than dismissed entirely, as it so easily could have been given the circumstances. Later that evening, after the estate had finally settled into a tense but peaceful quiet, the Duke sat alone in his study, reviewing the full account of everything that had transpired throughout the day. He thought about how close he had come to dismissing Eli's warning entirely, how easily pride and impatience could have carried him straight toward the fate Edmund had so carefully arranged for him. He thought too about the strange, unexplainable nature of Eli's dream, the vivid certainty that had driven the boy to risk everything by confronting a Duke in front of the entire household staff. It was not something the Duke could fully rationalize, no matter how many times he turned the details over in his mind. Perhaps it truly had been nothing more than a fortunate coincidence, a combination of overheard fragments and an anxious young imagination filling in the remaining details with unsettling accuracy. Or perhaps there was something more to it, something beyond simple explanation, that the Duke was not yet prepared to fully understand. Whatever the truth, one fact remained undeniable. A boy with no title, no wealth, and no reason at all to be believed had saved his life, while a trusted relative bound by blood and years of shared history had tried to take it. It was a lesson the Duke suspected would remain with him for the rest of his life, reshaping how he viewed loyalty, trust, and the true measure of a person's worth, regardless of the station into which they happened to be born. Outside his study window, the estate grounds lay quiet beneath a darkening sky, the earlier chaos of the day fully settled now, though the consequences of what had been uncovered were only just beginning to unfold. Formal arrangements would need to be made regarding Edmund's fate, and questions would inevitably arise among the wider nobility once word of the attempted betrayal spread beyond the estate's walls. But for tonight, at least, the Duke allowed himself a rare moment of quiet relief, grateful simply to be alive, and increasingly aware of just how much he still had to learn about the people surrounding him every single day. Morning arrived with a heavy silence hanging over the entire estate, the kind of silence that follows a storm no one had expected to survive. Servants moved through their duties with unusual quiet, exchanging quick glances but few words, aware that something significant had shifted within the household overnight, even if most of them did not yet know the full extent of what had happened. The Duke had slept little, his mind turning over the events of the previous day again and again, searching for anything he might have missed. Betrayal from a stranger was one thing, an unfortunate but understandable risk of holding power and wealth. Betrayal from Edmund, a man raised alongside him, taught the same lessons, shaped by the same family traditions, felt like something else entirely. It sat differently in his chest, heavier and harder to fully process. By mid-morning, the Duke summoned a small council of trusted advisors to the main hall, men who had served the Whitmore family for decades, and whose discretion he trusted completely. Among them was Walter Higgins, the estate's longtime legal counsel, along with two senior magistrates from the surrounding district who had been quietly informed of the situation the previous night. "We must proceed carefully," Walter advised, his weathered face drawn with concern as he reviewed the written statements the Duke had gathered. "A charge of this magnitude against a member of your own family will not go unnoticed. There will be questions, speculation, perhaps even attempts by other distant relatives to use this situation for their own advantage." The Duke nodded grimly, having already anticipated this complication. Noble families thrived on carefully maintained appearances, and news of an attempted assassination from within the family itself would send ripples through every corner of society, inviting scrutiny the Duke had never wanted nor welcomed. "I do not intend to hide the truth," the Duke said firmly. "Edmund attempted to take my life for personal gain. That truth will not be softened or buried simply to preserve appearances. However, I do wish to handle the matter with appropriate discretion, ensuring proper justice without turning this into a public spectacle that serves no one, least of all those who were harmed by his actions." The magistrates agreed to proceed with a formal but private hearing, to be held within the estate itself rather than in a public courthouse, given the sensitive nature of the case and the potential for wider political complications. Evidence would be presented, testimony recorded, and a judgment issued according to proper legal procedure, though away from the prying eyes of curious nobility eager for scandal. Meanwhile, Edmund remained confined within a secured room in the estate's eastern wing, guarded around the clock by men personally selected by Harold for their unwavering loyalty. He had said little since his arrest the previous evening, his earlier desperation giving way to a sullen, brooding silence that unsettled even the guards assigned to watch over him. The Duke visited him once that morning, standing just inside the doorway, while Edmund sat slumped in a chair near the window, staring blankly at the estate grounds he had once believed would eventually belong to him. "I want to understand," the Duke said quietly. "Not for the hearing, for myself. How long have you been planning this?" Edmund did not look up immediately, his jaw tight, his hands clasped loosely in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the warmth it once held during their shared childhood years. "Longer than you would believe," Edmund admitted. "It began as nothing more than idle resentment, watching you receive everything while I remained forever in your shadow. But resentment has a way of growing, Alaric, especially when nothing ever changes to ease it. Eventually, idle thoughts became something more concrete." "You could have spoken to me," the Duke said, his frustration bleeding through despite his attempt to remain calm. "Whatever grievances you carried, we could have addressed them honestly as family." Edmund finally looked up, a bitter, humorless smile crossing his face. "Would we have, truly? Or would you have offered the same polite reassurances you always did, promising consideration while nothing ever actually changed? I grew tired of waiting for scraps of acknowledgement that never fully materialized." The Duke studied his cousin for a long moment, searching for some remaining trace of the boy he had once known, the one who had raced him across the estate grounds as children, who had shared countless meals and secrets and small childhood adventures. He found little of that boy remaining in the hardened, resentful man sitting before him now. "You nearly succeeded," the Duke said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "Had it not been for a boy no one else thought to listen to, your plan would have worked exactly as intended. I would be dead, and you would likely already be presenting yourself as a grieving relative stepping forward to manage what remained of this family's holdings." Edmund's expression flickered slightly at the mention of Eli, something unreadable crossing his face before he looked away entirely, refusing to respond further. The Duke did not press the matter, sensing there was little more to be gained from continuing the conversation. He left the room shortly afterward, the weight of the exchange settling heavily upon him as he made his way back toward the main hall. Over the following days, the formal hearing proceeded exactly as planned, with careful testimony gathered from every relevant party. Daniel provided a detailed account of the threats used against him, his voice trembling but steady as he described Edmund's precise instructions regarding the carriage bolt. Peter Langley testified regarding the physical evidence discovered during his inspection, presenting the damaged bolt itself as undeniable proof of deliberate sabotage. Eli, too, was called upon to provide testimony, though the magistrates handled his questioning with particular gentleness, aware of his young age and the unusual circumstances surrounding his involvement in uncovering the plot. He recounted the overheard conversation near the carriage house, along with the vivid dream that had ultimately driven him to confront the Duke directly, despite the obvious risk of punishment for such boldness. One of the magistrates, an older man named Frederick Ashcombe, leaned forward with evident curiosity as Eli finished his account. "Young man, do you often experience dreams of this nature, ones that seem to reveal things you could not otherwise have known?" Eli shook his head uncertainly. "No, sir, I have never had a dream like that before. It felt different somehow, more real than an ordinary dream. I cannot fully explain it myself." Frederick nodded thoughtfully, making a brief note before allowing the boy to step down from his testimony. Whatever unusual circumstances had led to the plot's discovery, the physical evidence alone was more than sufficient to establish Edmund's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt, regardless of how that evidence had initially come to light. The hearing concluded after 3 days of careful deliberation, with the magistrates ultimately ruling that Edmund's actions constituted a clear and deliberate attempt against the Duke's life, motivated entirely by personal greed and resentment rather than any legitimate grievance. Given the severity of the crime, along with Edmund's status within the family, the magistrates determined that he would be stripped entirely of his remaining privileges within the estate and permanently exiled from Whitmore lands, forbidden from ever returning under threat of much harsher consequences. Some among the Duke's advisors had pushed for harsher punishment, arguing that exile alone seemed insufficient given the severity of attempted murder. But the Duke, despite his justified anger, found himself unable to pursue a more severe sentence against a man who had once been like a brother to him. Exile felt like a fitting resolution, severe enough to reflect the seriousness of the betrayal, while allowing the Duke to close this painful chapter without further violence staining the family's already troubled history. Edmund departed the estate quietly on the morning following the hearing's conclusion, escorted by a small group of guards to ensure he crossed safely beyond Whitmore territory without incident. He said nothing as he left, his expression unreadable, his future uncertain now that everything he had once believed would eventually be his had been permanently stripped away by his own actions. The Duke watched from a distance as his cousin's carriage disappeared down the long drive leading away from the estate, feeling a strange mixture of relief and lingering sadness settle over him. Whatever bond had once existed between them, forged through years of shared childhood memories, had been irreparably shattered by greed and betrayal. There would be no reconciliation, no eventual return to the easy familiarity they had once shared. With Edmund's departure, the estate slowly began settling back into its usual rhythms, though the events of the previous days had left a lasting impression upon everyone who had witnessed them, directly or otherwise. Servants spoke in hushed, awed tones about the maid's son who had somehow saved the Duke's life through nothing more than a desperate warning and an unexplainable dream. Eli found himself the subject of considerable curiosity throughout the household, though he remained largely uncomfortable with the sudden attention, preferring the quiet familiarity of his usual routines alongside his mother. The Duke, however, had no intention of allowing the matter to simply fade quietly into the background without proper acknowledgement. He called Margaret and Eli to his study once again, several days after Edmund's departure, this time under far less tense circumstances than their previous meetings. "I have been considering how best to properly recognize what you have done for this family," the Duke said, addressing them both directly. Words alone feel insufficient given the magnitude of what you prevented. Margaret shifted uncomfortably, unaccustomed to such direct attention from the Duke regarding matters beyond her usual household duties. Your Grace, we require nothing beyond what we already have. Eli only did what felt right in the moment. We do not expect any special reward for it. Perhaps not, the Duke replied, but you will receive one regardless. Margaret, effective immediately, you will assume the position of estate housekeeper, overseeing the entire household staff with all the additional compensation and authority the role carries. And Eli, I intend to ensure you receive a proper education, one befitting your evident intelligence and courage, regardless of the circumstances of your birth. Both Margaret and Eli stared at the Duke in stunned silence, clearly overwhelmed by the unexpected generosity of his offer. Margaret's eyes filled with tears once again, though this time they carried nothing but grateful disbelief at the sudden shift in their family's fortunes. Your Grace, I do not know what to say, Margaret finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. You need not say anything beyond accepting the offer, the Duke replied, a rare, genuine smile crossing his usually composed features. You and your son have earned this many times over. It is the very least this family can offer in return for what you have given us. As Margaret and Eli left the study that afternoon, still processing the sudden transformation in their circumstances, the Duke remained behind, reflecting quietly on everything that had transpired over the past several days. He thought about how close he had come to losing everything, not just his life, but the entire legacy his family had carefully built across generations. And he thought about how that legacy had ultimately been preserved not through wealth, status, or noble bloodlines, but through the simple, unwavering courage of a young boy who had refused to remain silent, regardless of how easily his warning could have been dismissed entirely. It was a lesson the Duke suspected would reshape how he approached leadership for the remainder of his life, teaching him to listen more carefully to voices he might once have overlooked entirely, understanding at last that true loyalty and wisdom often emerged from the most unexpected places imaginable. 3 years passed across the Whitmore estate, and with them came changes so gradual that few noticed just how completely the household had transformed since the events surrounding Edmund's betrayal. The scars of that difficult period had not vanished entirely, but they had softened considerably, folded quietly into the estate's ongoing history, alongside countless other stories accumulated across generations of Whitmore family life. Eli, now a lanky boy of 13, spent his mornings in lessons with a private tutor the Duke had personally arranged, a patient scholar named Wallace Fitch, who had quickly discovered that his young student possessed a sharp, curious mind, capable of absorbing complex ideas with remarkable speed. Mathematics came easily to Eli, as did history and the careful study of estate management. Subjects the Duke had specifically requested be included in his education. Given the unusual path the boy's future now seemed destined to follow. Margaret, meanwhile, had settled comfortably into her expanded responsibilities as estate housekeeper, earning the respect of the household staff through fair, capable leadership that balanced firmness with genuine warmth. She often marveled privately at how dramatically their circumstances had shifted since that terrifying morning 3 years earlier, though she remained grounded enough never to take the Duke's generosity for granted. The Duke himself had changed as well, though the transformation was subtler, revealed mostly through small shifts in how he approached leadership across the estate. He listened more carefully now to servants who might once have gone unheard, understanding intimately how easily valuable insight could be dismissed simply because of who delivered it. He established a practice of regular meetings with staff representatives from every department of the household, ensuring concerns and observations reached him directly rather than becoming lost within layers of hierarchy that had previously separated him from the daily realities of estate life. News of Edmund occasionally reached the estate through distant channels, though the Duke rarely inquired directly about his former cousin's circumstances. What little information filtered back suggested Edmund had struggled considerably following his exile, unable to secure meaningful position or standing without the protection of the Whitmore name behind him. Whether this brought the Duke any satisfaction, he never openly admitted, though those closest to him sensed a quiet, complicated sorrow whenever Edmund's name happened to arise in conversation. It was during the autumn of that third year that circumstances arose which would test everything the Duke had learned from the events surrounding his near assassination, offering an unexpected opportunity to demonstrate just how thoroughly his perspective had shifted. A dispute had been brewing among several tenant farmers on the estate's eastern boundary, concerning water rights along a stream that ran through several adjoining properties. Tensions had escalated over recent weeks, with accusations flying between families who had farmed neighboring plots of land for generations without significant conflict. The estate's usual method of resolving such disputes involved formal hearings conducted entirely by the Duke's senior advisors, with little direct input sought from the farmers themselves beyond brief, structured testimony. This time, however, the Duke insisted on handling the matter personally, traveling out to the eastern boundary alongside Harold and a small group of advisors to hear directly from those involved rather than relying solely on second-hand reports filtered through layers of estate bureaucracy. Eli, now old enough to accompany the Duke on certain estate matters as part of his ongoing education, joined the group that traveled out to the disputed territory, eager to observe firsthand how such conflicts were properly resolved. He watched carefully as the Duke moved among the gathered farmers, listening patiently to grievances from both sides, asking careful questions that revealed genuine interest in understanding the full complexity of the situation, rather than simply issuing a swift, convenient judgment. It was during this visit that Eli noticed something the Duke's senior advisors had apparently overlooked entirely. A young farmhand, hesitant to speak directly to someone of the Duke's standing, mentioned quietly to another worker that the stream's recent changes in flow pattern seemed connected to unusual construction taking place further upstream, on land technically belonging to a neighboring estate rather than the Whitmore property itself. Eli, remembering his own experience 3 years earlier of struggling to be heard despite possessing crucial information, approached the young farmhand directly, encouraging him gently to share what he had noticed with the Duke, rather than allowing the observation to go unheard simply, because he lacked the confidence to speak up among more senior members of the community. The farmhand, whose name was Thomas Ellery, hesitated at first, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of addressing the Duke directly. But Eli's quiet encouragement, along with his own experience of having once been dismissed before finally being heard, gave the young man enough courage to eventually approach Harold with his observation, which was then relayed to the Duke. The information proved crucial, revealing that the actual source of the water dispute originated not from any wrongdoing among the Whitmore tenant farmers themselves, but from unauthorized construction occurring on neighboring land, diverting water flow in ways that had inadvertently created the tension between families who had otherwise coexisted peacefully for years. The Duke was able to resolve the matter far more effectively once this crucial piece of information came to light, addressing the true source of the problem, rather than simply mediating surface-level disputes between farmers who had, in truth, done nothing wrong themselves. As the group traveled back toward the main estate later that day, the Duke rode alongside Eli, reflecting quietly on how the situation had unfolded. "You encouraged that young man to speak up," the Duke observed, glancing over at Eli with evident approval. "Most would have simply let the observation pass unnoticed, assuming someone else would eventually raise the concern if it truly mattered." Eli shrugged slightly, though a small, thoughtful smile crossed his face. I remember what it felt like, thinking no one would listen. I did not want him to feel that way too, especially when what he noticed turned out to matter so much. The Duke nodded slowly, considering the boy's words with genuine appreciation. That instinct, recognizing the value in what others might overlook, is a rare quality. Rarer still in someone your age. You continue to surprise me, Eli, even after everything that happened 3 years ago. As the years continued to pass, Eli's education progressed steadily under Wallace Fitch's careful guidance, eventually expanding to include practical training in estate management alongside Harold, who had grown to respect the young man's sharp instincts and genuine dedication to understanding every aspect of how the Whitmore lands functioned. By the time Eli reached his 18th year, he had become an invaluable presence within the estate's daily operations, trusted with responsibilities that would have seemed unimaginable for a maid's son when he was still a frightened child grabbing desperately at the Duke's coat sleeve. The Duke, now considerably older and increasingly aware of his own mortality following the near-disaster years earlier, found himself relying more and more heavily upon Eli's judgment across a wide range of estate matters. Where he had once trusted blindly in the loyalty owed to him by blood relatives, he had come instead to value the earned trust built through years of demonstrated character and consistent integrity, regardless of birth or social standing. It was during a quiet evening conversation, held in the same study where Eli had once nervously answered the Duke's questions as a frightened young boy, that the Duke finally addressed something he had been considering for quite some time. "I have no direct heir," the Duke said plainly, watching Eli's reaction carefully as he spoke. "My distant relatives have shown little genuine interest in the responsibilities such a position would require, focused instead purely on whatever wealth and status might eventually come their way. I have spent considerable time reflecting on who might be best suited to eventually oversee these lands and the people who depend upon them." Eli remained quiet, sensing the significance of whatever the Duke was building toward, though he did not presume to guess at the specifics. "I intend to formally name you as estate steward," the Duke continued, "with full authority over daily operations and eventual consideration as my successor, pending proper legal arrangements that I intend to pursue in the coming months. You have earned this position many times over, not through blood, but through years of proven character, wisdom, and genuine care for the people under this family's protection." Eli sat in stunned silence for a long moment, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what the Duke was proposing. It was a position far beyond anything he had ever imagined possible for himself, given the humble circumstances of his birth. And yet, reflecting on everything that had unfolded since that terrifying morning years earlier, it felt somehow like the natural culmination of a journey that had begun the moment he found the courage to speak up against overwhelming odds. "Your Grace, I do not know how to properly thank you for this," Eli finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. "You need not thank me," the Duke replied, a warm, genuine smile crossing his weathered face. "You saved my life once through nothing more than courage and honesty, qualities I have come to value far more than any noble bloodline could ever provide. This is simply the estate finally recognizing what has been true for years now. You belong here, Eli, not as a servant son, but as someone this family and these lands can trust completely." Word of the Duke's decision spread quickly throughout the estate and eventually beyond, into the wider circles of regional nobility who had long speculated about who might eventually inherit the significant Whitmore holdings given the Duke's continued lack of direct heirs. Some among the nobility expressed quiet disapproval, uncomfortable with such an unconventional arrangement that broke sharply from traditional expectations regarding inheritance and social standing. But the Duke, secure in his decision and unbothered by outside judgment, proceeded with the necessary legal arrangements regardless, determined to ensure his legacy would be protected by someone he trusted completely, rather than someone who simply happened to share his bloodline. Margaret, witnessing her son's remarkable transformation from a frightened boy pleading desperately at the Duke's coat sleeve into a respected steward entrusted with the estate's future, often found herself overwhelmed with quiet, tearful pride whenever she reflected on how dramatically their lives had changed. She never forgot the terror of that original morning, the fear that Eli's desperate warning might result in punishment rather than salvation. And she never stopped feeling grateful that the Duke had chosen, against all expectation, to listen carefully rather than dismiss a frightened child's warning entirely. Years later, long after the initial shock and scandal surrounding Edmund's betrayal had faded from active memory, the story of the Maid's son who had saved the Duke's life through nothing more than a desperate warning and an unexplainable dream had become something of a quiet legend among the Whitmore household staff, passed down through generations of servants who found inspiration in the tale's central message. It served as a constant reminder throughout the estate that wisdom, courage, and genuine loyalty were never determined by birth or social standing, but by the character and integrity individuals demonstrated when circumstances demanded difficult, often frightening choices. Eli himself, now fully established as estate steward and the Duke's designated successor, often reflected privately on that pivotal morning years earlier, still somewhat mystified by the vivid dream that had driven him to risk everything by confronting a Duke in front of the entire household staff. He never fully understood the source of that unexplainable certainty, though he had long since stopped questioning it, grateful simply that he had trusted his instincts rather than allowing fear of consequence to silence him entirely. The carriage that had once nearly carried the Duke to his death remained in storage within the estate's carriage house for many years afterward, a quiet, largely forgotten reminder of how close disaster had once come to permanently reshaping the Whitmore family's future. Occasionally, new servants would ask about the old, unused carriage, and older staff members would share the story, embellished slightly with each retelling, though the core truth remained consistent across every version passed down through the years. A maid's son had spoken up when silence would have been so much easier. A Duke had chosen to listen, against every rational instinct telling him otherwise. And through that simple, courageous act of speaking truth against overwhelming odds, an entire legacy had been preserved, transformed ultimately into something far stronger and more resilient than it had ever been before, built not upon rigid tradition and bloodline alone, but upon